For those of you who don't know me, I'm Cathy Carlson. I've been a lobbyist trying to change livestock grazing policy on federal lands now since 1987. Probably an example of one of those campaigns that you shouldn't follow that Jim was talking about, since you all bear witness to how successful that whole effort has been. It's overshadowed only by the success or lack of success of another issue that I work on as closely as grazing, and that's hard rock mining, in which we just completed a 5-year regulatory effort and found out that we actually took a significant step backwards last week in trying to reform the 1872 mining law. I think we got back to 1866. But here we are. We have 5 years under our belt with a new regulatory program that the Bureau of Land Management and the Department of the Interior has put in place called Rangeland Reform. It was Range Reform 93 for those of you who go back as long as I do, and I know some of you are out there. I wanted to talk for a few minutes about the history of this program and then give you some of the highlights or lowlights, depending on your perspective, of what happened with rangeland reform. We also have published a report. It's published but for the cover and whatever typos I find flying back on the airplane that I need to correct before we go to the printer on Thursday morning. But there are copies here for everybody if you'd like them. I had the good fortune of being in Washington, D.C. in 1993 at the beginning of the Clinton administration and the birth of rangeland reform. You have to picture it. This is 1993. 12 years of Republican rule of the White House just ended. The environmentalists in D.C., we throw a big party. We are so excited about the fact that the Clinton-Gore administration has come in. Thousands of people show up for the environmental inaugural. Al Gore comes and gives the keynote speech. We were riding a wave. We thought things were really going to be different as a result of this great change in administration. We had our first environmental push. The ink wasn't even dry on Clinton's inaugural address, and we run down to the White House and we say, we need a provision in your first budget, Mr. Clinton, that's going to do something about our western public lands. It's going to increase grazing fees for all the public lands. It's going to put that money into riparian restoration. It's going to put the money into conservation. We're going to take care of the royalty. We're going to finally charge a royalty for public lands. And we're going to do something about trees. I think we got rid of we're going to eliminate the forest road budget. Anyway, it was a three-prong attack. Boy, we were going to go out and get them. That same provision passed the House. We were rolling. It was March. We were rocking. It passed the Senate. It went to conference. Those of you know how bills work. In conference, the White House decides to drop it. They got some pressure from a couple of Western Democrats in the Senate who thought that this was much too draconian for the people in the West. And the Clinton administration dropped it. It was their first environmental decision. Okay, we regroup. It's still only April. We got lots of time left. We move on to the Interior Department. We go to Babbitt and Jim Baca, our champion, director of the Bureau of Land Management in 1993. We tell them that the environmental community is ready. We are ready to push through some comprehensive rangeland reform regulations. We are going to take on the grazing industry, and we are going to adopt some fundamental new policies. Interior buys the argument. They send up a trial balloon. It's called an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. They just sort of threw it out there for the public to see what the reaction's going to be. It had our wish list of changes. We were increasing the grazing fee. We were putting the money into different places than the rangeland betterment funds were going to be put in now. We were going to have national standards for setting the floor for environmental health. We were going to set an incredibly effective regulatory program, enforcement initiatives for the first time. Babbitt goes out the door with his advance notice of proposed rulemaking. He gets hammered. It was unbelievable. Clinton gets hammered. Clinton gets calls from all these Western Democrats. The Western senators, Democrat and Republican, they go nuts. Everybody except Harry Reid. And since we're in the great state of Nevada, I have to give some kudos to Senator Harry Reid. I think at the time he was still pissed off at the cattlemen because, if it's those of you who recall the race in 1992, he ran against Demar Dahl, who was the head or former head of the Nevada Cattlemen's Association. So he was ready to take on the cattlemen too. Okay, Clinton's getting hammered. Babbitt's getting hammered. Reid, our champion, unbelievably enough, he goes and tries to put into legislation our whole regulatory agenda, or most of it. The Senate goes into an uproar. Clinton and Babbitt collapse. They leave Reid hanging out to dry, not to mention the environmental community. Okay, it wasn't the third decision by the Clinton administration dealing with the environment, but it was a beginning of a trend. Babbitt decides to take his case to the West. He says, I'm going to go to the West and I'm going to just convince everybody that this is what we need to do. There were town hall meetings in every Western state. How many of you participated in those? There were a lot of those. Babbitt gets hammered some more. We couldn't muster the troops to support him around the West. The cowboys turned out in force. 250 cowboy hats would line up along some of these meetings. We suffered delay after delay after delay on Capitol Hill. We go through another round of meetings around the West. It was as painful as the first set for those of you who participated in them. Babbitt is personally involved in every step of this regulatory process. I actually had an occasion to sit in his office, actually in the Chief of Staff's office, early in 1995, and the secretary walks out from the anteroom between his office and Tom Collier's office, who was a chief of staff, and he says, I'm working on this standard for riparian areas. What do you think about this change in language, Tom? And we went, oh my Lord, here is the Secretary of the Interior drafting what the new standards are going to be for the biological health of all of our public lands. Tell me what's scary about that. Well, the rules went out in March of 1995. Another delay in Congress. We had to wait 6 months for the rules to go into effect. There was an immediate backlash on Capitol Hill, which was now in Republican control. This was the 104th Congress that was brought into office to roll back our environmental agenda. And on the short list of things to do was to roll back rangeland reform. We had some really bad bills, really bad bills, that were surfacing in the House and the Senate. The Interior Department rallies. Jim Baca's gone. Mike Dombeck is the acting director for the Bureau of Land Management. We stop really bad stuff from happening in the 104th Congress. We launch a new campaign. We do a counterstrike. We have a new champion, Jeff Bingaman. Unbelievable. Senator Jeff Bingaman arrives as the new champion for rangeland reform, and he stands up. As far as I know, it's the first time he's stood on his back legs on any environmental issue. But there he is. He's our champion. He goes to the Senate floor. He talks it up for us. Man, he delivers. We lost in the Senate, but we ultimately won. We kept bad bills from happening. But did we win the war? Did we get what we wanted out of rangeland reform? Babbitt showed up in Denver in 1996. He's got a very funny story to tell that he was telling to the Democratic Party faithful, which I will paraphrase for you, and wasn't nearly as funny as his telling. But basically, when he delivered rangeland reform to the Federal Register in 1995, he got a call from the White House saying, "You're never going to go to the West again, Secretary Babbitt." First, he couldn't leave the Beltway. Then he kind of was allowed to go across the Potomac River and into Maryland. Finally, he was able to get across the Chesapeake Bay. Within 6 months, the White House had kind of lessened the leash a little bit, and he got to go to Ohio and Indiana. But it took him 18 months to be given permission to get back to the West. And Clinton said he never wanted to hear the word grazing again, and he hasn't. Babbitt hasn't spoken much about rangeland reform either. Pat Shea came in and replaced Mike Dombeck as director of the Bureau of Land Management. He announced that rangeland reform was no longer a priority for the BLM. Years pass. The end of the century arrives. My friend Johanna Wald and I were talking with the Weiss Foundation about rangeland reform. Whatever happened to rangeland reform? You guys remember that? We kind of got it bloodied up in the early 1990s. And they were generous enough to fund a review. Whatever happened to rangeland reform? We had a nice junket, some of us. It was my first junket as an environmental activist. It was kind of fun. We put together a report, and that report will be released next week. There's copies of it back on the speaker's handout table in the other room. Please feel free to take a copy. Like I said, the only thing that will change in it are the cover and whatever typos I find. I wanted to give you some of the highlights and some of the lowlights. First of all, you might remember what some of the promises are. We were going to have a significant voice in Bureau decisions regarding livestock grazing through the creation of these resource advisory councils. We were going to have new standards for public land health that would be implemented to protect the public land for future generations. We were going to have immediate action to protect public land resources when damage to those resources was occurring. We were going to get uniformity out of this program so that grazing management practices would look the same across the West. And BLM was going to create a new framework that was going to give us so much more public participation in grazing management than we ever had before. These were Babbitt's commitments. These were the commitments that failed. We focused on a couple of key aspects of rangeland reform. First of all, the racks. The racks. It's not like, I'm on the rack, although there were some days it felt like that. The idea was that there was going to be people, regular people, sitting around the table all over the West. We were going to reach consensus on BLM's future. I sat on the Resource Advisory Council for 3 years. I wouldn't have traded it for the world. It was a fascinating process. But did the racks turn out the way we intended? What we found was that we didn't get the kind of balanced representation amongst the interest groups that we had anticipated going in. While the Resource Advisory Councils were successful in developing standards and guidelines, and even within the time specified, which was pretty short for trying to reach consensus, it was an 18-month window for most places, we got those standards and guidelines, and we got some level of consensus around them. But the resource councils have really floundered since then in terms of trying to figure out what to do, how to work, what to work on, how to get anything done. And the resource councils, by and large, are not participating in the implementation of the standards and guidelines for rangeland reform, which is a surprise because we made this huge investment in trying to get them up and running and then have sort of dropped the ball about actually getting them implemented. And that's not true of all resource councils, but by and large, it was a trend we found across the West. They generally do not operate by consensus. And the on-the-ground impacts of those decisions, even when they are made, don't appear to get expedited the way that we thought that they would. We haven't seen that kind of enhanced public participation in decision-making. We're strongly influenced and dependent on the commitment of BLM officials to decide what the resource advisory councils are going to work on. By and large, the BLM sets the agenda, and believe it or not, they don't bring really controversial issues to the REC. I think that there are even cases in which the BLM has tried to marginalize the role of the resource councils and things that are really important on the public lands. This is not a good situation. There's a lot of debate about consensus and whether you think consensus works, and it doesn't work, and the RACs are there. I think they will continue. We have some specific recommendations in this report on how to try and make them better, since they're out there, and it's pretty unlikely that they're not going to go away. We also looked at the standards for land health. The first most interesting thing I found about the standards was the BLM in various different states called them standards for different things. Some of them call them standards for grazing administration. In Colorado, we call them standards for public land health, thinking that they were going to apply to every issue on public lands, not just grazing. Some call them standards for rangeland health, like they don't apply to the forests, I guess, or the desert. And it's not clear what the distinction is, but we see these distinctions in the way the states even approach the name. The standards were supposed to set the floor for rangeland administration. If the land is not meeting that floor, something was supposed to happen. Some change, some action, something. In 1997, the BLM invited some environmentalists and some ranchers to talk to the agency, about 350 people in Denver, about implementation of the standards and guidelines and what we thought. And we thought that this process ought to be revolutionary. The rancher got up and said, this should be revolutionary. This should change the way BLM does its business. The BLM should focus on the land health first and make decisions based on the health of the land. We wanted to see the revolution, and boy, standards was going to deliver that for us. Well, we got standards in all but one western state. New Mexico, still kind of floundering around down there. They have come up with this idea that they want to protect the custom and culture of the land users on the public land. I don't think that they have us in mind when adopting that standard. It's been approved by the state director. It has not been approved by the Secretary of the Interior. It is a piece of unfinished business for this administration to make sure that the standards in New Mexico are soundly denied. And it's on the list of things that Mr. Clinton needs to do and Mr. Babbitt before they leave office. The standards in all the other western states look basically alike. All this talk that we ran into for years about how we couldn't possibly have national standards because of all the differences that we had to take into account in every western state. By the time we got to consensus in all the western states, it looked really alike. And we have a list of all of the standards that have been approved in our report and a summary of how they're similar and different. And you can see what the similarities are. But the consensus that was achieved in trying to meet standards basically gets us to the place that looks a lot like mom and apple pie. Riparian areas will meet proper functioning condition, whatever that is. Uplands will be healthy and sustain healthy, diverse populations. These are great generalities that everybody could agree upon, but the details are where the system breaks down. We had some specific findings about what's happening with the standards. There's no consistent regulation. Hey, how's that for a shock? BLM's off doing their own thing, different places, different times, with their own approach. Every Western state took a different approach to implementation. No consistency that was demanded at the national level, no consistency demanded on the ground by the state directors. And I hold the state directors accountable for the fact that this program isn't working. There are no consistency in when priorities are set for when the land is going to be reviewed. This whole idea that we're going to do the worst first and we're going to raise the boat by bringing all of the public land up to a healthy condition, a healthy floor, isn't happening. You've got states like Wyoming that have said, well, you know, where we already have a good cooperative relationship with the rancher, let's go do those first. And we're going to leave the bad guys alone because that's what we've always done. There are some states that are focusing on the worst problems first. The Phoenix district of BLM is taking on some tough challenges down there. They are trying, very inconsistent, even on where to go out and try and figure out where they need to raise the boat. There's a real inconsistency in trying to figure out where grazing impacts, making determinations about grazing impacts. Even when you see damage on the ground, the BLM says, oh, well, I'm sure there's another problem out there. In Utah, it's the elk. How many times have we heard that? If we didn't have the goddamn elk, we wouldn't have a grazing problem out here. Well, gee, the elk live on the public lands too, so maybe we should try and find room for both of them, or get rid of the cows, since the elk were probably there first. But there's a lot of problems in trying to figure out whether grazing is the problem in the first place, and the BLM is hiding their head in the sand in a lot of places. In decisions, the BLM has assumed that if they don't have any information that there's a problem, there's no problem. So we have a circumstance in which there's lousy data, or the data's old, or the BLM doesn't really look at the data, and they think, oh, well, we don't have any information that's available to us to show that there's a problem, and the livestock grazing is causing the problem, therefore we need to renew all the permits. And we have some pretty good examples about where those are taking place, even where they're decisions. And there's a few, unfortunately, only a few select places where we could find that actual decisions had been made to implement standards and guidelines. And there's some good places, and there's some not so good places. But the BLM is having a real problem in implementing any meaningful decisions and taking any action within the next grazing year. We are seeing these colossal projects, plans for pipelines and water developments and fences and all these wonderful things that are going to try and keep the cows on the land, but aren't going to raise the level of the playing field to this floor that we were all looking for in terms of public land health. Now what? This is where we're at. Well, we thought we might get Interior to focus some attention on this program since it was part of their first environmental decision. Maybe it could be some of their last, to actually get this program back on track, bring it back to the public forefront, and actually get some change. So we gave the Interior Department a draft report in April outlining all the problems that we had found in rangeland reform. BLM promises to do better. The state directors were given a copy of the report and a stern warning that they were called on the carpet for not doing their job. There have been 3 consecutive senior leadership team meetings in which the state directors have been told that they need to get with the program and they need to get this program back on track and they need to start implementing rangeland reform. The BLM promises that a new handbook will be written, which is going to give us consistency that we don't have already in all of the implementation of standards and guidelines around the West. They sent out, the BLM in September sent out an instruction memorandum which called for new data to be collected, which is going to be the kind of information that will hold the BLM accountable for actually getting standards implemented on the ground. They promised to do all these things by September. Well, September came and went. We wrote them a letter. We had a few phone calls. It's now almost December. BLM promises that this is going to be a renewed effort, and it might be out by February of 2001. It's probably too late. This initiative is an incredible missed opportunity for the agency to wrestle to the ground one of the most difficult problems that they face on the public lands. Jim is right that regardless of the election, I don't think things are really going to change in grazing administration on the public lands. We can keep bad things from happening on Capitol Hill. We can stop really bad bills. We're going to have to be really vigilant just to keep what we have now, just to keep this modest reform effort from being stripped away by the agency as it makes decisions. Laird Lucas is going to talk tomorrow about the successes that he's had in implementing standards and guides from a legal perspective and where the pressure points are. So if you're interested in this, I encourage you to listen to what he has to say. The last time I was in Reno, I had dinner with the head of the Idaho Cattlemen's Association and the director of the Public Lands Council. I have to say I'm glad I'm in much better company. I can't remember why I was here. But it was amazing to listen to the director of the Public Lands Council tell his membership that we are losing the war. The environmentalists are winning the war on grazing in the West. The livestock industry is on the ropes. They're down for the count. They're failing. I'm sure that the tail end of this was a pitch for more money. It didn't quite get to the tagline, but the Public Lands Council is telling themselves that they are losing. I was at a meeting of funders a couple weeks ago and also again a year ago, and I listened to Charles Wilkinson and Ed Marston declare that the war over grazing in the West has ended and the environmental community has won. And as funders, they need to move on to something else. And I raised my hand and I said, wow, that's amazing. How did that happen? I've been involved in this for some time, and I missed the fact that we won the war. Oh, they say it's because we have Rangeland Reform now on the books. So we're having people who are opinion makers telling the industry and telling people who care about their opinion that this is an issue that is largely over, or that we are sinking the industry. If we could just figure out how to turn that into something where we're winning on the ground, I think we would be awesome. And I really feel like the BLM, maybe less so the Forest Service, is on the cusp of some pretty fundamental change. If they think we're winning, we ought to act like we're winning, and we ought to get out there and beat the crap out of the agency and convince them that we're winning, because then they'll make decisions that are on our side instead of on the livestock industry side. We've got to figure out how to push forward, maybe with rangeland reform, maybe with some new tools in the toolbox, but I really feel like we're on the cusp of some fundamental change that we can make within the agency.